Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Despite the occasional public performances of concern and of anguish, are things going pretty much the way the Biden administration, alongside Israel, really want them to go in the Middle East? Let's get to the bottom line. It's a popular refrain here in Washington. U.S. strategy in the Middle East is an epic failure. But hold on for a minute. What if America's decision makers knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what would happen as they enable Israel and greenlight all its actions? It's not just in Gaza where Israel has obliterated the entire area, killing and maiming now more than 100,000 people in a single year. And now starting all over again, from the top in northern Gaza, forcing evacuations, emptying hospitals, targeting journalists. And it's much wider than that. Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, all now open for conflicts with Israel, with the United States riding their shotgun. So how and why did the Biden administration so willingly choose this path of intense and widespread carnage and upheaval? And with a major election around the corner, will the Democratic Party pay the price at the ballot box, even though the alternative may be even worse for the region? Today, we're talking with Matt Duss, the former foreign policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders and currently the executive vice president at the Center for International Policy. Matt, it's a privilege to have you on the show today. And I just want to open with a statement made by Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor, recently at the Embassy of Israel in Washington. And in this, and I'm going to read this, I see colleagues that I haven't just gotten to know in the crucible of the past year in this room, but in the work that preceded it, a project to make real the vision of broader peace, stability, and economic connectivity across the Middle East, and to make real a future where Israelis and Palestinians can live alongside one another in security, dignity, self-determination, and peace. That is the statement from the National Security Advisor of the White House at an assembly around the one-year anniversary of October 7th. I'd just like to get your reaction to that statement from Jake Sullivan.
Yeah, I mean, I think it unfortunately just seems completely detached from reality. First of all, the idea that there was any real effort to promote peace between Israelis and Palestinians before October 7 is, I think, just revisionist history. They've started to claim that they were about to release some kind of plan. It's in the works. If people read Frank Foer's piece in the Atlantic, clearly the administration is really trying to put out there that they were really just about to get serious about a Palestinian state before October 7 happens. But let's understand the logic of the administration's entire approach to the Middle East before October 7, and that was they wanted to spend as little time as possible on the Middle East, and to the extent that they were focused on the Middle East at all, they were mainly focused on ways to box China out of the Middle East, because their entire foreign policy focus, the lens through which they have seen foreign policy in general, is through this lens of strategic competition with China. So they were building on Trump's Abraham Accords, essentially, and that's what I think Jake means when he's talking about, interconnectivity and peace. And as I wrote in a piece shortly after October 7, I think October 7 really should have caused them to question that approach, because that approach was really built on this fantasy, as I see it, that the Palestinians could be just perpetually imprisoned under occupation. Maybe you would slightly improve their prison cell by, putting new drapes on the occupation or upgrading the occupation in some way. But broader than that, it was also premised on the support for a whole range of repressive, undemocratic governments in the region as a way of kind of solidifying or reconsolidating America's leadership role in the region. So again, when he talks about, kind of working with all of these people in that room at the Israeli embassy on regional peace, I'm not buying it.
Well, you've written this piece that you just mentioned, and I want to mention the title in the New Republic. And the title is Joe Biden Chose This Catastrophic Path Every Step of the Way. That's a provocative title. And when you watch the posture of the president, when you listen to him, he seems at this point anguished about the Palestinians, saying he's trying to encourage Netanyahu to go another way, basically saying that they lament the impact and casualties on Gaza, that they've encouraged Israel not to widen the war. And what you're arguing in this is that's baloney. I mean, you're basically saying the administration has had a policy beneath that anguish, if you will. So tell us about it.
Well, no, I'm not. I'm sure the president would prefer fewer Palestinians were being killed than are actually being killed. I mean, I do think it's clear that he lacks kind of sensitivity to Palestinians in general and always has. And I think what's so notable is that this is, Joe Biden is known as a very effective kind of retail person-to-person politician. He's knows how to show empathy. He's kind of legendarily good at that, except in certain cases and except toward certain kinds of people, unfortunately. But what I was getting at is whatever Joe Biden may or may not feel about Palestinians, whatever his, however many lamentations he may express, I don't really care. What I want him is to do something about it. That is what I care about. What is his policy? How is he using American power? How is he using the tools we have diplomatically and militarily to achieve a certain outcome? So, as we've seen over this past year, every few weeks, it seems, we get some new story leaked about how Joe Biden is really upset and he had a very tough call with Netanyahu and he's really at the end of his rope. And it becomes just ridiculous at some point. I think after about half a dozen times, it became clear that this was just this kind of routine they were going to keep going through because the policy just never changed. And as I write in the piece, the United States has considerable leverage, considerable tools to try and influence Israeli policy, to considerable ways to put pressure on Israel, mainly through the provision of military aid. We give extraordinary amounts of military aid that has really sped up over the course of this war, given the amount of armaments and ammunition that Israel is going through as they've just been pummeling Gaza. And at no time, except for one suspension of the largest bombs, did Biden even consider using that tool to change Israeli behavior.
So they're basically arguing something and putting themselves into knots to try to say, yes, Israel and its justice system and its military governance system is good enough for us in finding that there are no violations. But my book is, didn't the President of the United States, didn't the Secretary of State violate U.S. law, the Leahy law, with regards to the use of these weapons?
Right. The Leahy law and a number of other laws, the Arms Export and Control Act, the Foreign Assistance Act, there are a whole set of laws governing the provision of U.S. military aid. And it's not just that ProPublica report, although I really commend that report, which really lays it out in black and white, without question, that the State Department, USAID, and the U.S. Refugee Agency, two of the agencies within the U.S. government who are really responsible for making these assessments, had said very clearly that U.S. law was being violated, that the Israeli military was restricting humanitarian aid into Gaza. But we also knew this from pretty much every other humanitarian aid organization, including Palestinian and Israeli organizations that had been monitoring this for many months. We saw this from the statements of Israeli officials themselves from the first moments of this war, that this is what they were going to do. We understand from years and years of published military documents about Israel's military doctrine going back to the 2006 Lebanon war, that the infliction of civilian suffering is part of Israel's concept of self-defense. This is not in any serious question. And what you said about what we hear from the State Department and others about how, well, Israel's going to investigate itself. No, that's not enough. U.S. law requires the U.S. government itself to investigate these abuses and these alleged abuses, and this administration is simply refusing to do that in any credible or serious way.
Let me ask you about a statement that Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made to the citizens of Lebanon. It's a remarkable statement, and I just sort of wonder if we're becoming jaded in the media to remarkable statements of this sort. But he basically says, you have a choice, and the choice is you either become like Gaza and destroyed like Gaza, or you take on this challenge within your own society and sort out your civil war. I mean, it's an interesting thing. You either do this or I'm going to flatten and destroy the infrastructure of your country. It's an incredibly aggressive comment.
Right, an absolutely outrageous comment by any definition. But again, it just shows that Netanyahu knows that as long as he has U.S. support, he can do this without consequence. The United States is the only country that it can impose any real costs on Netanyahu or on the Israeli government such that it could potentially change their behavior. And this is what I wrote and have said and written before. Biden has simply refused to even try and impose those costs. And I think that is an absolutely irresponsible approach. And I think we see the costs right now already. This is not just a catastrophe in Gaza, but a growing regional catastrophe, and one which I think will be paying the costs and consequences for many years to come.
But I guess my question is thinking about Israel's incentives and disincentives.
Yeah.
What will take this in a different track? Or are we basically in right now, a period of time of permanent, deep conflict in the broad Middle East region with no cessation, and Israel essentially going on and defining which enemies it has and being fueled by the United States? Is that the only future we have at the moment?
Unfortunately, I think the latter right now. It seems over the past few weeks, in the wake of the strikes on Lebanon, the assassination of Nasrallah, the decapitation of Hezbollah's leadership, and the incursion into Lebanon. Basically after the proposed ceasefire agreement, President Biden, saying, I expect we're about to get a ceasefire in Lebanon. And then Netanyahu said, nope, gonna kill all of Hezbollah's leaders and invade Lebanon instead. Since that time, the U.S. posture seems to have changed. And basically Biden seems to be just riding this war down like Slim Pickens in Dr. Strangelove. Even the statement that came out, the readout of the call between Netanyahu and Biden made no mention of a ceasefire in Lebanon. They have completely dropped that. And I'm really concerned that, there does seem to be, there's clearly a sense in Washington, like this sense of exaltation that is just dangerously and terrifyingly reminiscent of, the lead up to the Iraq War, this sense that, well, by dint of our enormous power or Israel's enormous military power, we're essentially going to reshuffle the deck in the Middle East and kind of rearrange the security arrangement in the Middle East in a way that's more beneficial to us. And it's really kind of staggering for those of us who lived through that we would have to relearn this lesson. It will not work. Israel clearly has enormous capabilities. They've scored a number of very, very impressive tactical victories. I don't think anyone could deny that. But what we've seen, year after year after decade in that region is that both the United States and Israel have utterly failed to turn these tactical victories into strategic wins. And that is what we still have yet to see from either the U.S. or Israel is any explanation of how this ends.
I'm really interested, as Israel has gone on this course to basically, and as Prime Minister of Israel Netanyahu talks about, taking out all of the enemies of the state of Israel right now, and largely the White House acquiescing to that, frankly, right now, are they also basically taking off the table all of those legitimate self-determination, civic justice, human rights advocates within these societies?
We have a policy, and this goes back a long time, but it's far worse now, by upholding Israeli impunity and essentially enforcing Palestinian hopelessness. We have affirmed and supported the worst, most hardline elements in all of these societies. And I think that is exactly what we're seeing now. This idea that Israel is just going to move, kind of like Michael Corleone at the end of Godfather and settle all family business. We know how that ultimately ended. Okay? It did not end well for Corleone or anyone, but I'll also say we saw exactly this back in early 1980s when, Israel decided, well, we're going to take out our enemies in Lebanon. Tried to take out the PLO leadership and deal with family business then. And what happened? Well, one thing that happened is the rise of Hezbollah. So my concern is what comes next. What is going to arise in the wake of this catastrophe that the United States and Israel have been cooperating to inflict on this region?
Some of the Arab states' postures confuse me in the region, because while we hear a lot from Jordan, the foreign minister of Jordan, the king of Jordan, also leadership in Egypt, and the broader GCC states, et cetera, about anguish, concern about the broadening of crisis, nobody's ripping up a peace deal with Israel. No one's really creating a consequence within the diplomatic arena for Israel. Aren't they complicit as well as the White House in what's happening?
Oh, I think they are clearly complicit. I mean, I definitely can see, if we look at, some of these regimes like the Emiratis or others, they clearly find it attractive that Israel would be taking out some of whom they think are their enemies too, Islamist groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, who is seen as a partner, who is a partner of Iran. But again, I'm not going to bet a lot on the kind of vision, the foreign policy vision of these kinds of regimes, because part of what is driving that is these are regimes that do not represent the views of their own people. They often live in fear of their own people. And again, this is why I would look to some of the recent comments that were published from Mohammed bin Salman. Certainly no friend of the Palestinians, no friend of peace. He is a vicious, corrupt dictator, and yet he understands that he's essentially has to take, public normalization with Israel off the table for the time being in the wake of Gaza, because he knows that his own people will not accept a peace agreement or any kind of normal diplomatic relations with Israel. Certainly after what we've seen over the past year, but until there is actually a credible path to Palestinian liberation. So I think what you're saying is all right. But I also think, these regimes, Saudi Arabia and others, do have to be conscious and pay some attention to the public outrage that is rising.
What is happening in the United States right now with regards to the politics of this? And, as you sort of look, I mean, you're a Democrat, you work for Senator Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders was out there saying, hey, if we didn't take a different course, America would be seen as complicit around the world in what Israel is doing. Would love to get a sense what you think the potential impact a few weeks before a presidential election might be from this conflict.
Well, clearly, I mean, this has been a major issue in the Democratic Party, not just since October 7 and the war after that, but, in years leading up to that. As you said, Senator Sanders, when he first raised the issue of Palestinian rights back in the 2016 primary in that debate with Hillary Clinton, and got an enormous response in that room, but then an enormous response from Democrats throughout the country, particularly young Democrats. I think that just expressed something that had been trending for a very long time. And that is, I think, younger Democrats, not only younger Democrats, also, Black Americans, young Jewish Americans, other groups in the party have understood that, the U.S.-Israel relationship and the treatment of the Palestinians was in many ways an exception and basically a contradiction to claims of racial and social justice, claims of values of equality, that a lot of these Democrats take very seriously. I'm one of those Democrats. The impact here may end up being marginal, I think, especially since Biden is no longer the candidate and Vice President Harris is less closely tied to the policy. Everyone understands that Biden has been driving this. Vice President Harris has been more vocal about Palestinian rights and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. I think people do appreciate that. But even if the impact is marginal, this election is going to be very, very close. And I think it will be won or lost on the margins. And if we're talking about, a few thousand votes or a few tens of thousands of votes in a state like Michigan or Pennsylvania, this could end up making the difference.
Do you think the Democratic Party leadership is aware of how palpable this concern, particularly among younger Democrats, but also communities of color and others who see the Gaza crisis and these broadening crises as a social justice issue in addition to foreign policy? But do you think the elites of the Democratic Party said, screw that, screw them, we're making a calculation, we're nowhere, so that it's deliberate, the ignoring of this issue and the shoving it under the rug again?
Yeah, unfortunately, I do. Unfortunately, I think to the extent that the Democratic Party leadership appreciates this problem at all, they think it's a messaging problem. And it is not. It is a policy problem. So, yeah, there's a range of issues, this being one of them, where I think the Democratic Party leadership is kind of out of touch with the rank and file voters, where it's dominated by an older mentality and older understanding of both the politics and the policy. But it is clear that they've made a decision that ultimately this won't matter that.
Look, we're either going to have Donald Trump as a returning president to the White House or Kamala Harris, first woman of color, as president of the United States. Do you see either of these leaders getting the backbone, I suppose, to basically change course and say enough is enough, that we're going to use American leverage, we're going to cut off weapons to try to make sure that there's a different course in the Middle East, and that the United States, if it's going to be complicit in anything is going to be complicit in a constructive track rather than a destructive track.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think both have the potential to surprise us. I would say in the more positive sense, knowing some of the people who are advising Vice President Harris, I think there's a possibility. Again, I don't think anyone should be surprised that she has chosen not to distance herself openly from the president in whose administration she continues to serve. I think there are things she could say to signal a bit more space. She's choosing not to do that, again, because I think she is playing it fairly safe and clearly choosing to kind of play to the center on this. But once taking office, or if she does win, I would really hope to hear very quickly what she is going to do differently, because I really think I would love to know that she understands what an absolute catastrophe this policy is for the region and for our country. Donald Trump, it's slightly different. If we're going to see anything good from him, it'll be because Donald Trump just gets tired of all the attention being focused on the Middle East. I think one thing you can always depend on with Donald Trump is that he is always focused on Donald Trump. And if he were to come into office and decide, well, we're getting sucked into too much attention here, let's just wrap this thing up, putting some pressure on Bibi. I don't know what that'll look like. Again, I don't want to pretend that it's going to be any kind of serious run at peacemaking, as we know from the first Trump administration, where his policy to the Middle East was essentially run by Jared Kushner and David Friedman. I think we'll definitely see a leaning back in hard to the kind of Abraham Accords, arms sales for peace, focused on Iran, focused on China. But it could surprise us in a very bad way, as in maybe in a possibly good way. Although, unfortunately, if it does, I think it would be in a worse way.
How worried are you about that outcome?
I am worried. I mean, he has shown. I mean, listen. I mean, Trump likes to talk about how we didn't get into any new wars in his presidency, and that is not. That is largely by accident. We were fortunate. There were moments when we were very close. I think closer than we may have ever been to war with North Korea. That we were closer, I think, than we may have ever been to war with Iran in the wake of the assassination of Qasem Soleimani back in 2020. It is no accident that the first two and only war powers resolutions passed by Congress were passed under Donald Trump's administration, because Congress really felt the need to assert its war powers in a way it had never done before, because Donald Trump was behaving so recklessly in that region. I think coming in with a team that is much more focused and much more organized, as he clearly will this time, could put us in a potentially much more dangerous place.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much. Former foreign policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders and current executive vice president of the Center for International Policy, Matt Duss. Really appreciate you being with us today.
Thanks, Steve.
So what's the bottom line? In foreign policy and national security, there are just a lot of illusions. There's intellectual escape hatches, policy gobbledygook, rationalizations for whatever happens when a leader feels they need to say one thing and actually do another. That's Joe Biden right now in the Middle East. If the U.S. president wanted to push Israel to stop killing innocent Palestinians and to stop illegally interfering in aid delivery, he could say, do it, or your weapons are going to wait on America's docks until your posture and your behavior change. Biden hasn't done that. He knows exactly what's going on. To paraphrase Shakespeare from the play Hamlet, he doth protest too much, methinks. Expressions of concern, talking about how they push the Israelis here and there, but to quote Shakespeare again, that to me is a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing. And that's the bottom line.